Tonight, we step away from the noise of the world and into the quietness of the Buddha's wisdom. These aren't teachings that demand anything from you. They're offerings, gentle reminders of the peace that exists beneath the surface of your busy mind. Welcome to Buddha Bedtime Stories. This is your sacred pause, where ancient truth meets your need for rest. I'm curious to know, what time is it where you are? And where are you listening from tonight? Please share in the comments. The Buddha walked this earth over 2,000 years ago, yet his insights into the human heart remain as fresh as this moment. He understood suffering intimately, and he discovered the way through it. Tonight, his wisdom becomes yours. These stories will work on you gently, the way moonlight works on a dark room. You don't need to chase understanding. Just allow the teachings to arrive in their own time, in their own way. Before we begin, take a moment to truly care for your comfort. Let your body find its most natural, restful position. There should be no strain anywhere, nothing pulling or holding tight. Breathe in slowly, feeling the breath move all the way down into your belly, and release, letting your shoulders drop, your jaw soften. One more deep breath, inviting your entire being to rest. Let us enter the first story together. In a mountain village, there lived a woman named Sayuri, who had a reputation as an oracle. People would travel from distant places to seek her wisdom on important decisions. Should I marry this person? Should I pursue this business opportunity? Should I move to a new city? But Sayuri had an unusual way of responding to questions. She never gave direct answers. Instead, she would reply with more questions. A merchant came to her asking, "Should I invest in this new trade route?" Sayuri replied, "What would make that investment right for you? What would make it wrong? Which outcome could you live with more easily?" The merchant, frustrated, pressed her. "But what do you think I should do? Why does my opinion matter more than yours?" Sayuri asked. "You know your circumstances, your resources, your risk tolerance. I don't. How could my answer be better than the answer you would reach by examining your own wisdom?" People found this approach maddening. They wanted clear guidance, definite answers, someone to tell them what to do. Instead, Sayuri gave them questions that turned their attention inward. A young woman came asking whether she should accept a marriage proposal. "The man is suitable," she explained. "My family approves. But I feel uncertain." "What is the uncertainty?" Sayuri asked. "I don't know if I love him enough." "What is enough love for marriage?" Sayuri inquired. "Who defines that measure? And more importantly, what does your uncertainty tell you?" The young woman sat with these questions. Slowly, she realized she already knew her answer. The uncertainty wasn't confusion. It was clear trying to be heard beneath the noise of expectations and social pressure. She didn't want to marry this man. She had known it all along, but had been afraid to acknowledge it. "You already had your answer," Sayuri said when the woman expressed this realization. "You just needed permission to hear it. If I had told you what to do, you would have either resented me for the advice or become dependent on me for future decisions. But by asking questions, I helped you find your own wisdom. Now you trust yourself more than you did before." A farmer came with a more desperate question. His crops were failing. and he needed to decide whether to borrow money to try new methods or sell his land and find other work. "Please," he begged, "just tell me what to do. I can't decide." "What happens if you borrow and the new methods fail?" Sayuri asked. "I lose everything." "What happens if you sell the land?" "I lose my family's heritage, but I avoid debt." "Which loss could you live with?" Sayuri continued. "Losing everything, including your dignity, through failed debt, or losing your land but keeping your freedom from debt? Which regret would be smaller?" The farmer thought deeply. He realized that he valued security over heritage. The land was important, but being debt-free was more important. Once he saw this clearly, his decision became obvious. "But what if I'm wrong?" he asked Sayuri. "What if you're right?" she countered. "Why assume the wrong choice is more likely than the right one? And even if you choose poorly, will you learn something? Will you adapt? Or will you be paralyzed forever by fear of making mistakes?" These questions shifted something in the farmer. He had been treating the decision as if one choice was absolutely right and the other absolutely wrong. But Sayuri's questions helped him see that both choices had consequences. Both involved trade-offs. And he needed to decide based on his values, not on some objective standard of rightness. Word spread about Sayuri's approach. Some people avoided her, frustrated that she wouldn't just give answers. But many sought her out precisely because she didn't. They recognized that her questions were a kind of teaching, helping them develop their own wisdom rather than borrowing hers. A Zen monk visited Sayuri, curious about her method. "You could make a good living telling people what to do," he observed. "They want certainty. They would pay well for it. Why do you refuse to give it?" "Because certainty from outside is false security," Sayuri replied. "If I tell someone what to do and it works out, they credit me and become dependent on me for future decisions. If it doesn't work out, they blame me and still haven't learned to trust themselves. Either way, I've made them weaker, not stronger." She poured tea for them both. But when I ask questions that help them find their own answers, they become stronger. They learn to consult their own wisdom. They develop confidence in their decision-making. Even if they choose poorly, they learn from their own mistakes rather than blaming someone else. The monk nodded thoughtfully. "Your questions are a form of teaching. You're not withholding wisdom. You're pointing people toward the wisdom they already possess." "Exactly," Sayuri agreed. "Most people have more wisdom than they realize. They just don't trust it. They've been taught to look outside themselves for answers, to defer to authorities, to doubt their own judgment. My questions permit them to trust what they already know." She looked at the monk directly. "The same is true in meditation practice, isn't it? A good teacher doesn't give you enlightenment. They ask questions or create situations that help you recognize what's already there. The wisdom isn't imported from outside. It's revealed from within." "Yes," the monk agreed. "The best teaching is the teaching that makes itself unnecessary by helping students trust their own understanding." Years passed, and Sayuri grew old. People worried about who would replace her as the village oracle. But Sayuri refused to train a successor. "I haven't been giving answers," she said. "I've been asking questions." "Anyone can do that. You don't need a special oracle. You need to practice asking yourselves better questions." She taught the village a method, When facing a decision, ask yourself questions instead of seeking immediate answers. What do I value most in this situation? What outcome could I live with most easily? What does my hesitation tell me? What would I advise a friend in this situation? What do I already know that I'm afraid to acknowledge? These questions, Sayuri explained, are tools for excavating your own wisdom. The answers are already in you. You just need to dig them out from under the layers of fear, expectation, and conditioning. On her deathbed, surrounded by villagers who had come to thank her for her guidance over the years, someone asked, "Sayuri, what is the most important question?" Even then, she smiled and replied with a question. What question would help you most right now? And when you've answered that, what question would help you next? The most important question is always the one that moves you deeper into your own understanding. Tonight, as you rest, what questions might you ask yourself? Not demanding answers, not forcing resolution, just inquiring gently into your own experience. What am I feeling right now? What do I need in this moment? What wisdom am I carrying that I haven't yet listened to? What am I afraid to acknowledge? You don't need someone else's answers. You don't need an oracle or expert to tell you what to do, how to feel, who to be. The wisdom is already in you, has always been in you, waiting for the right questions to draw it out. Ask yourself questions tonight and listen for the answers that rise from your own depths. They're more trustworthy than anything someone else could tell you. Rest now in your own wisdom, asking and listening, questioning and discovering. The oracle you seek is you. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. a tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. It's a structural weakness. Or it's a story, the governor replied. This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them. He held the bowl up to the light. I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea. A perfect bowl says nothing except, look how skilled the potter is. This bowl says something more interesting. Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone. Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack, running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. This crack, the emperor said finally, is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial. He looked directly at Masao. Did you make this crack deliberately? No, Your Majesty, Masao admitted. It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it. Then it's a gift, the emperor replied. A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws. After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created. But it's cracked, Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. Exactly, the tea master replied. Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly. He held the bowl carefully. In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest. Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire. And these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. The cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw, Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say. The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way. He would show students two bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. There was a master calligrapher named Kenzo who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He could write each character with flawless precision, every stroke exactly as the ancient masters had prescribed. His work was technically perfect, exhibited in galleries, and purchased by collectors who valued his adherence to classical standards. But Kenzo had a secret dissatisfaction. Despite the praise and recognition, his work felt lifeless to him. Each piece was an exercise in replication, a demonstration of technique, but nothing more. He was copying perfection that had been established centuries ago, adding nothing of himself, discovering nothing new. One day, an important patron commissioned a piece for a temple dedication. The character to be written was Mu, meaning emptiness or void. Kenzo prepared carefully, mixing his ink to exactly the right consistency, selecting his finest brush, and setting up his workspace with meticulous attention to every detail. He had practiced this character thousands of times. He knew exactly how it should look. He visualized every stroke in his mind, preparing to execute it perfectly. But as he positioned his brush above the paper, his cat, who normally slept quietly in the corner during his work, suddenly leapt onto the table. The cat's paw hit Kenzo's arm just as he was beginning the first stroke. The brush dragged across the paper in a completely unintended direction, creating a wild, irregular mark that bore no resemblance to proper calligraphy. Kenzo's first reaction was anger. The perfect paper was ruined. Hours of preparation wasted. He would have to start over, and he was already behind schedule. He grabbed the ruined piece, intending to crumple it and throw it away, but something made him pause. He looked at the mark more carefully. The stroke was wild, yes, completely improper by classical standards. But it had an energy, a life, a spontaneous quality that none of his careful, perfect strokes ever achieved. It looked like emptiness, like void, like the very essence of Mu in a way his technically correct versions never had. The mark captured something real about emptiness, its unpredictability, its resistance to control, its indifference to our intentions. His planned perfect versions had been illustrations of the concept. This accidental mark was somehow the thing itself. Kenzo sat staring at this mistake for over an hour. Finally, he decided to build the rest of the character around it, incorporating the wild stroke instead of starting over. The final piece was unlike anything he had ever created. It combined his technical skill with this element of pure accident, planned mastery with unplanned spontaneity. When he delivered the piece to his patron, he apologized. "I must confess, this isn't what I planned. My cat interfered, and the first stroke went completely wrong. I tried to salvage the piece, but it's not traditional calligraphy. I understand if you want me to create a new one." The patron studied the work in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's wrong," Kenzo protested. "The first stroke violates every principle of proper form." "It's alive," the patron replied. "Your other work is beautiful, technically flawless, but it's like looking at a preserved flower. This piece is like seeing a flower growing wild. It has breath in it, spontaneity, the quality of something happening right now, rather than being carefully reconstructed from the past." He hung the piece in the temple, and people came from across the region to see it. Other calligraphers studied it, trying to understand how Kenzo had achieved such vitality. Some tried to recreate the effect by deliberately making mistakes, but these forced accidents never had the same quality. The life in Kenzo's peace came from the genuineness of the accident, not from calculated imperfection. A Zen master who viewed the piece said to Kenzo, "Your cat understood something you had forgotten, that true art comes from responding to the moment, not from executing a plan. For 40 years, you've been copying the past. In one moment of accident, you created something present." "But I can't plan accidents," Kenzo said. "I can't make this happen deliberately." "Exactly," the master replied. "That's why it worked. Your planning mind, your control, your perfection, all of that had to be interrupted for something real to emerge. The cat was your teacher." From that day forward, Kenzo's approach to calligraphy changed. He still practiced technique, still maintained his skills, but he stopped trying to control every aspect of the outcome. He began leaving space for accident, for the unexpected, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom. Sometimes he would start a piece without complete preparation, letting the consistency of the ink vary, allowing the paper to be slightly wrinkled, welcoming small imperfections. Sometimes he would work faster than was comfortable, not giving himself time to calculate every movement. Sometimes he would deliberately do something unusual, breaking a rule to see what would happen. Not every piece succeeded. Many experiments failed, but the successful pieces had a quality his earlier perfect work had lacked: presence, immediacy, life. They felt like they were happening rather than being displayed. They invited the viewer into an experience rather than presenting a completed achievement. Other calligraphers criticized this departure from classical standards. "Kenzo has abandoned proper technique," they said. "He's making mistakes deliberately." This isn't true calligraphy. But Kenzo understood something they didn't. Technique wasn't being abandoned. It was being liberated. He had spent 40 years building technical mastery. Now he was learning what to do with that mastery, not to control and perfect, but to create conditions where truth could emerge spontaneously. "The technique serves spontaneity," he would tell students. "You practice until the movements are natural, until you don't have to think about them. Then you let go of trying to be perfect and allow something real to happen. The years of practice give you the skills. The letting go gives you the art." One student asked, "But how do you know when to let go? How do you know when you've practiced enough?" "You don't," Kenzo admitted. "I practiced for 40 years before my cat taught me to let go. Maybe that was too long. Maybe it wasn't long enough. The point isn't reaching some perfect amount of preparation. The point is remaining open to the moment when control needs to give way to spontaneity." He showed the student his temple piece with its wild first stroke. "I could never recreate this exactly. I could make similar pieces, but this particular mark came from this particular moment of accident. That's what makes it true. It's not a reproducible technique. It's a response to what actually happened." Years later, when Kenzo was old, he was asked to demonstrate calligraphy for the emperor. It was considered a great honor. Most calligraphers prepared extensively for such occasions, practicing for weeks to ensure a perfect demonstration. Kenzo prepared differently. He practiced just enough to be warmed up, then went to the demonstration with no fixed plan. He would respond to the moment, to the energy in the room, to whatever impulse arose. It was terrifying and exhilarating. As he stood before the emperor with brush and paper, he felt all his years of perfect control wanting to take over. The safe thing would be to execute a flawless classical piece. But instead, he paused, breathed, and let go of control. What emerged was neither perfectly planned nor completely accidental. It was something in between: technique meeting moment, skill dancing with spontaneity, the practiced hand responding to the unpracticed impulse. The character he created had both mastery and wildness, both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the emperor was silent for a moment, then said, "I have seen many demonstrations of perfect technique. This is the first time I've seen calligraphy that felt alive. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where you're over-controlling, over-planning, and trying to perfect everything before you act. What would happen if you made space for accident, for spontaneity, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom? What if your careful plans are actually preventing something more true from emerging?" The perfect mistake teaches that life isn't lived according to plan. The most authentic moments come when planning gives way to presence, when control releases into response, when the prepared hand meets the unprepared moment. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect execution. You need technique in the service of spontaneity, skill as a foundation for letting go. Rest now in the space between planning and accident, between control and release. Let yourself be like Kenzo's brush, prepared by practice, but freed from the need to be perfect. Tomorrow might bring a cat leaping onto your carefully prepared plans. Let it. The interruption might be the teacher. The accident might be the truth. The mistake might be perfect. There was a farmer named Hideaki who worked his land diligently, waking before dawn and laboring until dusk. His son, Daichi, seemed to be his opposite, lazy, sleeping late, avoiding hard work whenever possible. Hideaki was ashamed of his son and frustrated by what he saw as wasted potential. "That boy will never amount to anything," Hideaki would complain to his neighbors. "I work myself to exhaustion while he lounges under trees and daydreams. He has no ambition, no drive, no sense of responsibility." The neighbors agreed with Hideaki's assessment. They saw Daichi as a disappointment, a young man who would never succeed because he lacked his father's work ethic. Some pitied Hideaki for having such a lazy son. Others judged Daichi harshly, predicting he would become a burden on his family and community. What no one knew, including Hideaki, was that Daichi spent his time under those trees observing. While appearing to do nothing, he was watching everything. How water moved across the land, which areas stayed moist, and which dried quickly, where wind patterns created microclimates, and how different plants thrived in different locations. Daichi was learning the land in ways his father, focused only on immediate work, never had. While Hideaki fought against the land's natural tendencies, trying to impose his will through hard labor, Daichi was learning to understand the land's own wisdom. One year, a severe drought struck the region. Hideaki worked harder than ever, carrying water to his crops, trying to save them through sheer effort. But most of his crops died anyway, as did the crops of other hard-working farmers. The drought was too severe for labor alone to overcome. But Daiichi, who everyone thought was lazy, quietly directed his efforts to the areas of the farm he knew, from his observations, retained moisture longest. He planted drought-resistant varieties in the driest areas. He used the natural wind patterns he had observed to create shade and reduce evaporation. He worked with the land's characteristics rather than against them. By the end of the season, Daiichi's sections of the farm had produced a modest but real harvest, while Hideaki's sections had produced almost nothing despite his exhausting efforts. Hideaki was stunned. "How did you do this? You barely worked compared to me." "I worked differently," Daiichi explained. "While you were laboring, I was learning. While you were fighting against the land, I was understanding it. My apparent laziness was actually observation. I was working, just not in ways that looked like work to you." He showed his father the subtle features of the land he had noticed, the slight depression that collected morning dew, the rock formation that created afternoon shade, the soil composition that retained moisture better than surrounding areas. "I learned all this by watching," Daiichi said, "by sitting still and paying attention rather than constantly moving and doing." Hideaki felt something shift in his understanding. He had been so focused on visible labor, on constant activity, on the appearance of hard work that he had never stopped to actually understand what he was working with. His son, whom he had judged as lazy, had been doing a different kind of work, the work of observation, understanding, and learning. "I'm sorry," Hideaki said. "I judged you without understanding what you were doing. I thought activity was the same as productivity, that visible effort was the same as effective effort. You were working all along, just in ways I didn't recognize as work." Word spread through the village about Daiichi's success during the drought. People who had judged him as lazy began to see him differently. Some felt ashamed of their premature conclusions. Others were curious about his methods. Daiichi began teaching other farmers what he had learned. He showed them how to read the land, how to observe rather than just labor, how to work with natural patterns rather than against them. The farmers who had once thought him lazy began to value his seemingly idle observation time. "I used to think you were wasting your life under those trees," one neighbor admitted. "Now I understand you were studying. You were learning in ways that look like laziness to people who don't understand what learning can be." A Zen monk who heard this story visited Daiichi. "You've learned an important lesson that many people never learn," the monk said. "You've learned that judging too quickly, based on appearances and conventional standards, often misses the truth. Your father judged you by how much visible labor you performed, but the quality of your outcomes proved that visible labor isn't the only measure of value." Daiichi nodded. "I learned something else too. I learned that what looks like laziness might be rest, or observation, or a different kind of work, and that what looks like hard work might be an inefficient struggle. Appearances are misleading, outcomes reveal truth." The monk smiled. "Your story reminds people not to judge too harshly or too quickly. The lazy son might be a careful observer. The apparently wasted time might be valuable learning. The story that seems simple at first viewing often has complexity that only reveals itself later." Years passed, and Daiichi became known as a wise farmer, though he still spent time sitting under trees, watching the land. His father, who had once been ashamed of him, now proudly told people, "My son taught me that there are many kinds of work, and the work that looks least like work is sometimes the most valuable." Hideaki learned to balance his own labor with periods of observation. He became a better farmer by incorporating some of his son's apparent laziness, taking time to watch and understand rather than constantly acting. One day, a young person came to Daiichi asking for advice. "My parents think I'm lazy because I spend time reading and thinking instead of working constantly. They say I'll never succeed. What should I do?" Daiichi smiled. "Keep reading and thinking, but also find ways to apply what you learn. Let your outcomes speak for you, not your appearance in the industry. My father thought I was lazy until he saw what I produced. Your parents will understand when they see the fruits of your different kinds of work." He paused, then added, "But also understand their perspective. To someone who values visible labor, observation looks like idleness. To someone who measures worth by constant activity, stillness looks like laziness. Don't judge them for judging you. Just prove through outcomes that your way has value too." The young person asked, "But what if I fail? What if my approach doesn't produce results?" "Then you learn and adjust," Daiichi replied. "I wasn't just sitting under trees doing nothing. I was observing, learning, thinking, and planning. If my approach had failed, I would have learned from that and tried something else." The point isn't that observation is always better than labor. The point is that judging approaches too quickly before seeing their outcomes often misses value. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider who you've been judging as lazy or unproductive. What if their stillness is observation? What if their rest is preparation? What if their apparent inactivity is actually a different kind of work that you don't recognize? And what about yourself? How harshly have you judged your own times of rest or stillness? Have you internalized the belief that only visible activity counts as work? Have you dismissed the value of observation, learning, thinking, and resting because these don't look like traditional labor? Not all work looks like work. Not all productivity is visible. Not all success comes from constant striving. Sometimes the lazy son who watches patiently sees what the hard-working father who never stops moving misses. Sometimes stillness achieves what activity cannot. Sometimes the full story only reveals itself long after the first judgment is made. Rest now without judging your rest. Let yourself be Daiichi under the tree, observing, learning, preparing in ways that might not look productive to outside observers, but that create real value. The lazy son wasn't lazy. He was doing a different kind of work. And so are you, even in this moment of apparent inactivity. Rest is work. Observation is productivity. Stillness is motion that hasn't revealed itself yet. Trust that the full story of your life will prove this, even if current appearances suggest otherwise. Sleep now, not lazy, but learning. Not inactive, but preparing. Not wasting time, but using it in ways that will only reveal their value when the drought comes, and your careful observation produces a harvest where frantic labor produced nothing. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a ship's navigator named Takeshi, who prided himself on never losing his way. He had sailed the coastal waters for 20 years, and in all that time, he had never once deviated from his intended course. He relied on a compass that had been given to him by his father, a master navigator, and this compass had never failed him. Takeshi's confidence in his navigational abilities was absolute. He knew exactly where he was at all times, could calculate his position by the stars, by the currents, by the wind. His captain trusted him completely, and other sailors spoke of Takeshi as someone who could navigate through the darkest night or the heaviest fog without ever being uncertain of his position. But one day, during what should have been a routine voyage along a familiar coast, something happened that shattered Takeshi's certainty. His compass began behaving strangely. The needle wavered, spun unpredictably, and then stopped working entirely. When Takeshi tried to get his bearings from the stars, heavy clouds covered the sky. The familiar landmarks he usually used were hidden by an unusual mist. For the first time in 20 years, Takeshi was lost. His initial reaction was panic. Without his compass, without his usual reference points, he felt completely disoriented. The ship was still moving, but he had no confidence in the direction they were heading. Every decision felt uncertain. Should they continue forward or turn back? Should they anchor and wait for the fog to clear, or try to push through? The captain came to find him. "Takeshi, what's our position?" "I don't know," Takeshi admitted, the words painful to say. "My compass is broken. I can't see the stars. The landmarks are hidden. Captain, I'm lost." The captain was quiet for a moment, then said something unexpected. "Good. Maybe now you'll actually see where we are." Takeshi was confused. "But I don't know where we are." "That's the problem. You've sailed these waters for 20 years, the captain said. You've relied on your instruments and your calculations. But have you ever really looked at the water itself? Have you ever paid attention to how it feels to sail through it, rather than just measuring your position within it?" The captain walked to the rail and looked out at the misty water. "When I started sailing, I had no instruments. I learned to read the water, the wind, the subtle signs that told me where I was and where I was going. You've always had your compass, so you never develop that sense. Maybe being lost is your opportunity to find a different way of knowing." Takeshi wanted to argue, but the truth was they had no choice. The compass was broken, and no amount of worry would fix it. He would have to navigate without his primary tool, without the certainty he had always relied on. So he began to pay attention in ways he never had before. He noticed the color of the water, which changed subtly with depth and seafloor composition. He felt the temperature of the wind on his face, which varied based on what land masses it had passed over. He watched the patterns of seabirds, which could indicate proximity to shore. He listened to the sound of the waves against the hull, which changed depending on bottom depth and current patterns. All of these signs had always been there. He just had never needed to notice them because his compass had told him everything he thought he needed to know. Now, forced to rely on more subtle indicators, he discovered a whole language of navigation he had been blind to. After several hours of this intense attention, Takeshi realized something. He had a sense of where they were, not the precise, measured certainty his compass had provided, but a felt sense. an intuitive knowing based on multiple subtle cues. It wasn't as comfortable as the false certainty his compass had given him, but it felt more real, more connected to the actual experience of being on the water. He gave the captain his best estimate of their position and the direction they should sail. "Are you sure?" the captain asked. "No," Takeshi admitted, "but I'm not completely lost either. I'm somewhere in between, navigating by feel rather than by certainty." They sailed based on Takeshi's intuitive navigation. Several hours later, when the fog finally cleared, they discovered they were exactly where Takeshi had estimated, perhaps even more accurately positioned than if he had been rigidly following his compass bearing. A Zen monk was traveling on the ship, making a pilgrimage to a distant temple. He had watched Takeshi's struggle with interest. That evening, he approached the navigator. "You've learned something valuable today," the monk said. "I've learned that I've been overly dependent on my tools," Takeshi replied. "That's a humbling lesson." "More than that," the monk said. "You've learned that there are different kinds of knowing. The compass gave you one kind, precise, measurable, certain, but it was a narrow knowing. It told you your position, but nothing about the water you were moving through, the wind you were sailing on, the life of the ocean around you." He looked out at the darkening water. When you lost that narrow certainty, you found a broader knowing. Less precise perhaps, but more connected, more alive, more responsive to what's actually happening rather than what should be happening according to your instruments. Takeshi thought about this. But isn't certainty important? Don't we need to know where we are? "There are different kinds of certainty," the monk replied. "The compass gave you the certainty of measurement. But measurement isn't the same as understanding. Today, without your compass, you develop the certainty of relationship. You know where you are not because an instrument tells you, but because you're in relationship with the water, the wind, the birds, all the subtle signs. This kind of knowing is less precise but more intimate." Over the following days, even after Takeshi had replaced his broken compass with a new one, he found himself relying on it less. He had discovered that he could navigate by reading the signs around him, by paying attention to subtle cues, by trusting his felt sense of position and direction. The compass was useful for confirmation, but he no longer needed it as his primary tool. Other navigators noticed the change in Takeshi's approach. He seemed more relaxed, more connected to the sailing itself rather than anxiously checking his instruments every few minutes. Younger navigators would ask him for advice. The most important thing, Takeshi would tell them, is to not become so dependent on your tools that you lose your own capacity to sense and understand. Tools are useful, compasses are valuable, but if you rely on them exclusively, you become helpless when they fail. And more than that, you miss the actual experience of navigating, of being in relationship with the water you're moving through. He would tell them about the day his compass broke. "I thought I was lost, and in one way I was. I had lost my usual certainty, my measured precision. But in another way, I found something I had been missing for 20 years. I found direct contact with the elements I was navigating through. I found a different kind of knowing that doesn't come from instruments but from attention and relationship." One young navigator asked, "But what if you're wrong? What if you follow your intuition and it leads you astray?" That can happen, Takeshi admitted. Just as following a compass can lead you astray if the compass is broken or if there's magnetic interference you don't know about. No method is perfect. But when you're navigating by attention and relationship, you notice when things don't feel right. You can adjust. When you're blindly following an instrument, you might sail confidently in the wrong direction without realizing it until it's too late. Years passed, and Takeshi's reputation changed. Instead of being known as the navigator who never lost his way, he became known as the navigator who could find his way even when lost. People understood there was a difference, and the second reputation was actually more valuable. A merchant who hired Takeshi for a difficult voyage once asked him, "What happens if we get lost?" Takeshi smiled. "We probably will get lost at some point. Weather changes, conditions shift, instruments fail. But being lost isn't the problem. Staying lost is the problem. And I've learned how to find my way even when the usual markers are gone. Being lost has become part of how I navigate, not something I try to prevent at all costs." The voyage was indeed difficult, with unexpected storms and compass problems. But Takeshi navigated through all of it, sometimes with certainty, sometimes with intuition, sometimes acknowledging that he wasn't sure but making his best estimate based on all available information. The ship arrived safely and the merchant was impressed. "You seem comfortable with uncertainty," the merchant observed. "I've learned to be," Takeshi replied. "Certainty is valuable when you can have it, but most of life involves some degree of uncertainty, some degree of not knowing exactly where you are or where you're going. The question is whether that uncertainty paralyzes you or whether you can navigate through it, using whatever signs are available, trusting your judgment, adjusting as you go." He looked out at the harbor where they had docked. "That day my compass broke was one of the most important days of my sailing life. It forced me to develop capacities I had been neglecting. It taught me that there are many ways of knowing, and the most precise isn't always the most useful. It showed me that being lost can be the beginning of finding a better way." The merchant nodded thoughtfully. "I think I've been sailing through my business life the same way you used to sail, following my instruments, my plans, my certainties. And when things don't go according to plan, when my compass breaks, I panic. Maybe I need to learn what you learned." "Maybe you do," Takeshi agreed. "Maybe we all do. Because life is going to break our compasses. It's going to take away our certainties and our familiar reference points. The question is whether we fall apart when that happens, or whether we discover we have other capacities, other ways of knowing, other methods of finding our way. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what compasses have broken in your life. What certainties have you lost? What familiar reference points are no longer available? These losses can feel frightening, disorienting, like being lost at sea without navigation tools. But what if being lost isn't the disaster you think it is? What if it's an opportunity to develop new capacities, to discover ways of knowing and navigating that you've been neglecting? What if the broken compass is forcing you to pay attention in new ways, to trust senses you've been ignoring, to find your way through relationship and intuition rather than measurement and certainty? You don't need to know exactly where you are right now. You don't need perfect clarity about your direction. You're not lost in a catastrophic sense. You're just navigating without your usual instruments, which means you have to pay attention more closely, trust yourself more deeply, be more present to subtle signs and signals. Rest in the uncertainty tonight. Let yourself not know. Let yourself be somewhere between lost and found, navigating by feel, trusting that you have capacities beyond your usual tools. The compass will break sometimes. That's not failure. That's life inviting you to find a different way, a deeper way, a way that connects you more intimately with the journey itself. You know more than you think you know. You can find your way even when you can't measure your position. Being lost is just another form of navigation, one that requires more attention, more presence, more trust. And sometimes, being lost leads you to places you never would have discovered if you had stayed on your carefully plotted course. Sleep now in the uncertainty. You don't need a compass to rest. You don't need to know where you are to be okay right here. Let yourself drift without reference points, trusting that you'll find your way when morning comes, not through certainty, but through attention, not through instruments, but through relationship with whatever each moment brings. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain village famous for its textiles, there was a master weaver named Chio who created cloth of extraordinary beauty. Her patterns were intricate, her colors perfectly balanced, her technique flawless. People would travel for days to commission work from her loom, and her pieces hung in the homes of nobles throughout the province. Then, one winter morning, Chio woke to find her hands had stiffened with arthritis. The pain was intense, but worse was the loss of the fine motor control that her craft demanded. She could no longer work the shuttle with her usual precision. The delicate adjustments that created her signature patterns were now impossible. For a weaver, this seemed like a death sentence. Chio's entire identity, her life's work, her purpose, all depended on her hands. Now those hands betrayed her, refusing to do what she commanded. She sat before her loom for hours, weeping, unable to imagine a future without her craft. Days turned to weeks. The loom sat silent. Chio refused visitors, refused commissions, refused to even look at the beautiful threads that had once brought her such joy. Her apprentice, a young woman named Nao, came regularly, begging Chio to teach her, to at least pass on knowledge if she could no longer create. But Chio sent her away each time. "What's the point?" she would say. "Without my hands, I have nothing to teach. I am nothing." One day, Nao arrived with a request that Chio couldn't refuse. A small child from the village was sick, and his mother had asked if Chio might weave even a simple cloth for the child's comfort. "She doesn't expect your fine work," Nao said gently. "She just wants something made by you, even if it's rough. She believes your cloth has healing in it." Chio couldn't say no to a sick child, so she returned to her loom for the first time in months. Her stiff hands struggled with the shuttle. The tension was uneven. The pattern she attempted came out distorted. Everything her hands produced now was clumsy, imperfect, wrong. But she continued, driven by compassion for the child. She created a simple blanket, nothing like her former masterpieces. The weave was loose, the pattern irregular. the whole piece marked by the limitations of her arthritic hands. She wrapped it with shame, certain the mother would be disappointed. When Nao delivered the blanket, the mother held it and began to cry. "It's perfect," she said. "Tell Chio it's the most beautiful thing she's ever made." Nao brought this message back to Chio, who couldn't believe it. How could that rough, imperfect work be beautiful? It's everything I spent my life learning not to create. The mother said she could feel the struggle in it, Nao reported. She said she could feel your hands fighting to create something despite the pain. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can emerge from difficulty, that limitation doesn't mean the end of creation. Her child is struggling too, and she said this cloth would remind him that struggle can still produce beauty. This response shook something loose in Chio's understanding. She had thought beauty required perfection, that her arthritic hands could only produce inferior work. But this mother had seen a different kind of beauty, the beauty of creation despite limitation, of persistence through difficulty, of love expressed through imperfect means. Chio returned to her loom with a new perspective. She stopped trying to create what her hands could no longer produce and started exploring what they could produce. The patterns that emerged were unlike anything she had made before. They were asymmetrical, organic, and marked by the randomness of her unpredictable hand movements. They told stories of struggle and adaptation, of beauty that included rather than denied imperfection. People noticed something profound in this new work. Her earlier pieces had been technically superior, but these new pieces touched something deeper. They were relatable in a way perfection never is. They spoke of being human, of limitations, of finding beauty not despite obstacles, but through them. "Your old work was impressive," one patron told her. "This new work is moving. I look at your perfect pieces and admire them. I look at these new pieces and feel understood." Chio began teaching again, but with a transformed philosophy. "I spent 30 years pursuing perfection," she would tell students. "I thought my value as a weaver came from my technical mastery. But arthritis stripped that away and showed me something more important. That beauty doesn't require perfection. That limitation can reveal new possibilities. That the work of imperfect hands can touch hearts in ways that perfect technique never could." She would show students her early work alongside her later work. "These first pieces show what skilled hands can do. These later pieces show what love can do with whatever hands you have. Which is more valuable?" The answer isn't obvious. Nao, who had continued as her apprentice through all these changes, asked one day, "Do you wish you could have your old hands back? Do you miss being able to create perfectly?" Chio thought for a long time before answering. "I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "I miss not feeling pain with every movement, but I don't miss who I was when perfection came easily." That Chio was skilled but narrow. She understood only one kind of beauty. This Chio, with her stiff, painful hands, understands more. The arthritis took my technical perfection, but it gave me depth I never had before. She held up her gnarled hands. "These hands taught me what my young, nimble hands never could, that obstacles refine what truly matters. When I could create anything, I created what was impressive. Now that I can only create with difficulty, I create what's true." The limitation stripped away everything superficial and left only what's essential. Years passed, and Chio's hands grew worse. Eventually, she could barely work the loom at all. But by then, her teaching had become as valued as her weaving once was. She taught people to see obstacles not as endings, but as refinements, not as barriers, but as editors that remove what's unnecessary and reveal what's essential. Every limitation is a teacher, she would say. It shows you what really matters by taking away what doesn't. My hands took away my technical mastery and revealed that mastery was never the point. The point was always connection, expression, and the creation of beauty that touches hearts. I can do that with arthritic hands. I just had to learn a different language of beauty. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own limitations, your own obstacles, your own arthritic hands. What has been taken from you that felt essential? What can you no longer do that once defined you? These losses aren't just subtractions. They're refinements, removing what's superficial to reveal what's essential. Your obstacles are teaching you something. They're stripping away the easy answers, the impressive exteriors, the technical perfections that never touched anyone's heart anyway. What remains, what you can still do despite your limitations, that's what truly matters. That's where your real beauty lives. Rest now in acceptance of your arthritic hands, your imperfect instruments, your limited capacities. They're not preventing beauty. They're refining it, teaching it, revealing it in forms you never would have discovered through ease and perfection. The weaver's silent loom eventually spoke with more power than her perfect one ever did. Your limitations will teach you the same truth if you let them. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right. That what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand. That what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper. That the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions. Both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards, and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. "My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction?" "Tell me about your son," Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. "It's backwards," she insisted. "Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature." "Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing," Fumiko suggested gently. "Is he talented musically?" "Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty." "Doesn't it?" Fumiko asked. "The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong." She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. "This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a garden temple, the monks kept a beautiful crane named Haku in a large bamboo enclosure. Haku had been brought to the temple as an injured chick, nursed back to health, and raised in the enclosure where he was safe from predators and provided with ample food. For 3 years, Haku lived comfortably in his bamboo home. The monks fed him daily, cleaned his space, and even spoke to him in gentle tones. He had everything a crane could need except freedom, though the monks assured themselves they were keeping him safe. One day, a traveling priest named Osho visited the temple and saw Haku in his enclosure. The priest noticed that Haku's wings had grown strong and full. He was clearly capable of flight, yet he never attempted to fly beyond the bamboo walls, even though portions of the enclosure were open to the sky. "Why doesn't your crane fly away?" Osho asked the monks. "He could if he wanted to," one monk replied. "We don't clip his wings." "But he stays because he knows this is where his food comes, where he's safe, where he belongs." Osho watched Haku for several days. The crane would walk around his enclosure, occasionally stretching his wings, but never attempting actual flight. It was as if Haku had forgotten that flight was even possible, that his wings had any purpose beyond stretching. On his last day at the temple, Osho asked permission to enter Haku's enclosure. He approached the crane slowly, then suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, startling Haku into the air. The crane's wings opened instinctively, and for a moment, Haku was flying, truly flying, circling above the enclosure in surprise. But after only 2 circles, Haku landed back in his familiar corner, as if the brief flight had frightened rather than thrilled him. He settled back into his routine immediately, walking the same worn paths he always walked. The monks were angry. "You scared him! You could have hurt him!" "I showed him he could fly," Osho replied calmly, "but he chose to land." That choice tells me something important. Your crane is imprisoned not by bamboo walls, but by comfort. He could leave any time, but he won't, because the enclosure has become more familiar than freedom. He looked at the monks gathered around him. And before you judge Haku too harshly, ask yourselves, how are you different? How many of you are living in comfortable enclosures of your own making, never attempting to fly because the familiar is safer than the possible? One young monk, named Botan, was particularly struck by this question. He realized he had been at the temple for 5 years, had taken preliminary vows, but had never fully committed to the monastic life. He was comfortable in this in-between state, receiving the structure and security of monastery life without the full commitment it demanded. Like Haku, he had wings he never used. After Osho left, Botan couldn't stop thinking about the crane. He began to see Haku differently, not as a bird being kept safe, But as a bird being kept comfortable in a cage, he could leave any time. And he began to see himself the same way. He started paying attention to all the ways the monastery had become his comfortable enclosure. He knew when every meal would come. He knew exactly what each day would bring. He had routines that felt safe, relationships that felt predictable, a life that felt controlled. And he realized this comfort was preventing him from attempting the flight that monastic life was actually meant to enable. The leap into full commitment, into genuine spiritual practice, into the risk and uncertainty that real transformation requires. "I've been living like Haku," Botan confessed to the abbot. "Safe and comfortable, but not really alive. Not really practicing, just walking the same familiar paths day after day." The abbot, who'd been troubled by Osho's words about the crane, nodded. "You're not alone." Many of us have made the monastery into a comfortable cage rather than a launching place. We've mistaken security for wisdom, routine for practice, comfort for peace. He gestured toward Haku's enclosure. The priest was right to startle the crane into flight, not to frighten him, but to remind him what his wings were for. Perhaps we all need to be startled sometimes, reminded that we have wings we're not using, capabilities we're not exercising, flights we're not attempting, because the ground feels safer. The monks began to look at their own lives with new eyes. They noticed patterns of comfortable avoidance, ways they stayed safely within self-imposed limits, flights they could attempt but didn't. The monastery, meant to be a place of transformation, had become for many a place of comfortable stagnation. Gradually, changes began to happen. Monks who had been avoiding difficult practices began to attempt them. Commitments that had been postponed were made. Risks that had seemed too frightening were taken. Not everyone changed. Some preferred the comfortable enclosure, but many discovered they had wings they had forgotten about. As for Haku, the monks began to encourage him to fly, taking him to open areas and gently startling him into the air. At first, he would fly only briefly before landing back in familiar territory, but eventually, his flights grew longer. One day, Haku flew beyond the temple grounds entirely and didn't return. The monks felt both loss and joy. They had loved having Haku, but they recognized that keeping him comfortable had been keeping him caged. Setting him free, truly free, not just free within limits, was the compassionate thing, even though it meant losing him. Botan, watching Haku disappear into the distance, felt inspired. If a crane can remember how to fly after 3 years of comfortable captivity, then surely I can remember what I came here to do. I've been in my bamboo enclosure long enough. He took his final vows that week, fully committing to monastic life. It was terrifying in a way his comfortable half-commitment had never been. But it was also exhilarating, like stretching wings he had forgotten he possessed. Years later, when Botan had become a teacher, he would often tell the story of Haku the crane. "We all build comfortable enclosures," he would say. "Relationships that feel safe but limit growth. Jobs that provide security but prevent exploration. Routines that feel comforting but cage us. The bamboo walls look like protection, but they're actually prevention, preventing us from discovering what we're capable of, from attempting flights we were made for." Students would ask, but how do we know when comfort has become a cage? When should we leave the enclosure? When you're walking the same paths day after day without growth, Botan would reply. When you've stopped even looking at the sky. When you've forgotten you have wings. When the thought of flying fills you with fear rather than excitement. These are signs that comfort has become captivity, that the safe enclosure has become a prison you don't recognize as a prison because it's comfortable. He would pause, then add, "The tragedy isn't being in the enclosure. The tragedy is forgetting you can leave, forgetting you were made for flight, forgetting that your wings have purpose beyond stretching." Haku lived 3 years in comfortable captivity before someone reminded him he could fly. How many years will you live in yours before you remember? Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own bamboo enclosure. What comfortable cage have you built for yourself? What safe patterns have you established that prevent growth? What flights are you not attempting because staying grounded feels safer? You have wings. You've always had wings. The question isn't whether you're capable of flight. You are. The question is whether you've become so comfortable with the ground that you've forgotten that the sky is where you belong. Whether the bamboo enclosure feels so safe that you've stopped noticing it's still an enclosure. Rest tonight with this awareness. Tomorrow, you could fly. You could attempt something that terrifies you. You could leave the comfortable patterns and risk the unknown. You could stretch your wings, not just as exercise, but as preparation for actual flight. The cage isn't locked. It never was. You've just been comfortable enough that you forgot to try the door. Sleep now and dream of flying. Let some part of you remember what your wings are for. And when you wake, maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to find out what happens when you actually use them. There was a fisherman named Sato who lived in a coastal village where fishing was both a livelihood and a tradition. Every morning the fishermen would go out in their boats, and every evening they would return with their catches. The measure of a good fisherman was simple. How many fish did you catch? Sato had been fishing since childhood. He knew the waters, understood the tides, and could read the weather. But despite all his skill and knowledge, he had a problem that plagued him. At least once a week, sometimes more, he would return with an empty net. Not a small catch, not a few fish, empty. Other fishermen would return with boats full of fish, and Sato would be pulling up nets that contained nothing but seaweed and water. It was humiliating. People in the village began to see him as unlucky, perhaps even incompetent, despite his years of experience. Sato's wife, Hana, watched her husband grow increasingly frustrated and ashamed. He would come home from these empty net days silent and dejected, barely eating, questioning his worth as a fisherman and as a provider. One day, after a particularly discouraging week where Sato had returned empty-handed 3 times, Hana said something unexpected. "I'm glad you caught no fish today." Sato looked at her in disbelief. "How can you say that?" "We need the income. The other fishermen are successful. I'm failing." "Come with me," Hana said, taking his hand. She led him to the small shrine at the edge of their property, where they would leave offerings for good fortune. On the offering plate were several small items: 3 unusual shells, a piece of interesting driftwood, a small colored stone. "Where did these come from?" Sato asked. "From your empty nets," Hana replied. "On the days when you caught no fish, You brought home these things instead. You were so focused on what you didn't catch that you never looked at what you did bring back. She picked up one of the shells. This one you brought back 2 weeks ago. I'd never seen a shell like this before. I showed it to the teacher at the school, and she used it to teach the children about sea life. Those children learned something beautiful from your empty net. She picked up the driftwood. This piece is so interesting in shape that the temple carver asked if he could use it for a small Buddha statue. Your failure brought something that will become sacred art. Sato looked at these objects with new eyes. He had indeed pulled them from his nets on empty days, but he had seen them as worthless, just debris that mocked him by taking the place of fish. "But we can't eat shells and driftwood," he protested. "We need fish to sell." "We need some fish," Hannah agreed, "and you catch enough on your successful days. But these empty net days bring other things, things with value that can't be measured in money, and they bring something else too." "What?" "They bring your presence home to me," she said quietly. "On days when you catch many fish, you come home exhausted but proud, and you spend the evening repairing nets and equipment, already planning the next day. But on empty net days, you sit with me, you talk with me. You're actually here, not already out on the boat in your mind. I know this sounds selfish, but I treasure those days when you come home empty-handed, because I get all of you, not just your tired body." This perspective shook something loose in Sato. He had been measuring his worth entirely by fish caught, seeing empty nets as pure failure. But Hannah was showing him that those apparently failed days brought other things, things he had been too ashamed to notice. A few days later, on another empty net morning, Sato pulled up his nets and found not fish, but a tangled mass of seaweed. His first reaction was the familiar frustration. But then he remembered Hannah's words and looked at the seaweed more carefully. It was a type he had seen farmers collecting for fertilizer. Instead of throwing it back in disgust, he kept it. When he returned to shore, he asked one of the farmers if the seaweed was useful. The farmer's eyes lit up. "This is exactly what I need for my fields. Would you sell it to me?" The money from the seaweed wasn't as much as fish would have brought, but it was something. And more than that, Sato realized he had just turned a failed fishing day into a successful day by changing what he was looking for. He began experimenting with this perspective. On days when fish weren't biting, instead of stubbornly keeping his nets in the water, he would pay attention to what else was happening. He noticed patterns in bird behavior that told him where fish might be on better days. He observed current changes that helped him understand seasonal movements. He collected things that others might value: certain shells, seaweed, and interesting stones. But perhaps most importantly, he stopped defining himself solely by the fish caught. He began to see himself not just as a fisherman, but as someone who harvested from the sea. Sometimes the harvest was fish. Sometimes it was knowledge. Sometimes it was presence of his wife. Sometimes it was objects that others valued for reasons he had never considered. Other fishermen noticed the change in Sato. He no longer came to shore on empty net days looking defeated and ashamed. He seemed interested in what he had found, curious about the day's experience even if it hadn't been conventionally successful. One young fisherman who was struggling with his own inconsistent catches asked Sato, "How do you stay positive when you fail?" I stopped calling it failure, Sato replied. Some days I catch fish. Some days I catch other things. Some days I catch nothing but return with more understanding of the sea. Every day has value if I'm looking for value rather than defining success narrowly. He showed the young fisherman his collection of interesting finds from supposedly failed days. If I had been catching fish every single day, I never would have noticed any of this. My failure to catch fish opened my attention to everything else. Now I know the sea that the most successful fishermen don't have, because their constant success never forced them to look at anything else. A Zen monk who was visiting the village heard about Sato's philosophy and came to talk with him. "You've learned something that many people never learn," the monk said. "You've learned that failure and success are not opposites but neighbors. Sometimes what looks like failure is actually success, in a form you didn't recognize. Sometimes getting what you wanted would have prevented you from discovering something more valuable." Sato nodded. "For years, I prayed to the sea gods to never return with empty nets. Now I understand that the empty nets were answering a different prayer, one I didn't know I was making. They were teaching me to see value beyond the obvious, to measure worth by more than one standard, to be present to what is, rather than always grasping for what should be." The monk smiled. "The empty net is a great teacher. Because it's empty, it can receive anything. Because it failed to catch what you were seeking, it caught things you weren't looking for. Sometimes the best gifts come through the door of apparent failure." Years later, when Sato was old and teaching his grandson to fish, the boy became discouraged after several days with small catches. "Grandfather, I'm not good at this. I keep failing." Sato smiled and showed his grandson the collection he had accumulated over the years. Unusual shells, interesting stones, pieces of driftwood, observations written down about sea and weather, and recipes for using seaweed. All of these came from days when I caught few or no fish. If every day had been successful by the measure I was using, then I would never have discovered any of this. Sometimes the empty net brings exactly what you need, just not what you wanted. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't fear failure. Don't rush to judge whether a day was successful or not. Some of my best days looked like my worst days at the time. The measure of success that seems obvious often isn't the most important one. Keep your eyes open for what the sea is actually offering you, not just what you came looking for." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own empty nets. What apparent failures in your life might be successes? Wearing different clothes? What disappointments might have brought gifts you were too focused on the disappointment to notice? What seemed like coming up empty might have actually been receiving something more valuable than what you were seeking. You don't need to catch fish every day. You don't need to succeed by conventional measures every time. Sometimes the empty net is exactly what you need, bringing lessons and gifts that success would have prevented you from receiving. Sometimes failure is just success that requires better eyes to see it. Rest now in acceptance of all your empty nets, all your apparent failures, all the times you came up short by the measures you were using. These weren't wastes. They were opportunities to learn different measures, to discover unexpected value, to receive what you weren't looking for but desperately needed. The empty net isn't a tragedy, it's a teaching. Let it teach you tonight. As you rest in the emptiness, that's actually fullness waiting to be recognized. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren, who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. "Your mirror shows nothing," they would say. "Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works." But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. "It shows me exactly what I need to see," she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, a vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing, just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. "Your mirror is broken," Ayame said with annoyance. "Don't you want to see yourself?" "I see myself perfectly well in this mirror," Ren replied. "What do you see?" "Nothing. It's too dark." "Exactly," Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, she found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayame mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayame thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged. Eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayame asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces? Barely, Ayame admitted. Can you tell which of us is more beautiful? No. Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us? No. Then we stand equal before this mirror, Ren said. Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here. Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. I think I'm beginning to understand, Ayame told Ren one morning. The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking. Ren nodded with satisfaction. The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware. She touched the darkened surface gently. Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could. Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. Your dark mirror freed me, she told Ren when she prepared to leave. I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance. After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. Why not just remove all mirrors? One asked. If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all? Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them, Ren explained. The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it. She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom. A philosophical student asked, But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it. Does it? Ren replied. The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. Your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach. Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. Keep this mirror, even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can. Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance. With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. "I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect," Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. "I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better. They just delayed it." Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things. Not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference. And then, when it's time, let go. At the edge of a village stood a house whose small garden received almost no direct sunlight. Tall buildings on either side cast shadows that leave the garden in shade for all but an hour each day. The previous owners had tried repeatedly to grow sun-loving flowers and vegetables, but everything either died or grew weak and spindly, stretching desperately toward the brief sliver of light. When Yuki moved into the house, neighbors warned her about the garden. "Nothing grows there," they said. "The shade is too deep. Better to pave it over and use it for storage." But Yuki looked at the shaded space differently. "It's not that nothing can grow here," she said. "It's that sun-loving plants can't grow here. The garden isn't bad. It's just suited for different things than the previous owners were trying to grow." She began researching plants that thrived in shade, ferns that loved the dim moisture, hostas with broad leaves that caught what little light appeared, shade-loving flowers that bloomed in muted colors, but with delicate beauty. Instead of fighting the garden's nature, she worked with it. Within a year, Yuki's shaded garden was lush and beautiful. It didn't look like sunny gardens with their bright flowers and robust vegetables. It had a different aesthetic, subtle, cool, mysterious. The greens were deeper, the flowers were more delicate. The whole space had a quality of quiet richness that sun-blasted gardens never achieved. Neighbors who had declared the space hopeless came to see what Yuki had created. They were amazed, though some were still dismissive. "It's pretty," one neighbor said, "but it's not a real garden. Real gardens have tomatoes and sunflowers and bright colors. Your garden is just making the best of bad conditions." "Are it conditions bad?" Yuki asked. "Or just different conditions?" "These ferns and hostas are barely surviving. They're thriving. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do in exactly the kind of environment they need. The previous owners failed because they tried to grow sun plants in shade. I'm succeeding because I'm growing shade plants in shade." She touched a particularly lush fern. "This plant would die in full sun. It needs shade. For this fern, my garden isn't difficult conditions, it's ideal conditions. The mistake is measuring all gardens by sun garden standards and calling everything else deficient." A young woman named Hannah, who lived nearby, was struck by this perspective. Hannah had always felt like she was growing in the shade in difficult circumstances that made the kind of success others achieved impossible for her. She had health issues that limited her energy. She lived in poverty, which restricted her opportunities. She lacked the family support that others took for granted. Everyone told her she needed to overcome these limitations, to find more light, to transform her difficult conditions into easier ones. But what if, like Yuki's garden, she just needed to stop trying to grow like a sun plant and instead discover how to thrive as a shade plant? She came to talk with Yuki about this idea. "I feel like I'm always failing," Hana admitted, "because I can't achieve what healthy, wealthy people with family support achieve. I'm trying to grow tomatoes in shade, basically. But I don't know what the equivalent of shade plants would be for a human life." Yuki walked her through the garden, explaining her choices. See how I chose plants that need less energy? That's like you choosing work that fits your energy levels rather than jobs that demand more than you can give. See how I selected plants that thrive in cool, moist conditions? That's like you finding strengths that develop specifically because of your limitations, not despite them. She pointed to a particularly beautiful shade flower. This would never survive in full sun. Its delicate petals would burn, but here, protected from harsh light, it blooms with a beauty that sun lovers can't achieve. Your limitations might protect you from certain kinds of harm while allowing you to develop qualities that people in easier conditions never develop. Hana began to reconsider her entire life. What if she stopped measuring herself by sun garden standards? What if she found shade garden ways to thrive? She had deep empathy, probably developed through her own suffering. She had patience, learned through chronic illness. She had creativity in making do with little, born from poverty. These weren't consolation prizes for failing at normal success. These were actual strengths, shade plant qualities that were valuable in themselves. She started making different choices. She took a job that paid less, but required less energy, allowing her to work sustainably rather than constantly burning out. She developed friendships with others who lived in shade, creating community with people who understood difficult circumstances. She stopped apologizing for needing things that others didn't need, recognizing that shade plants legitimately need different care than sun plants. Word spread about Yuki's garden and the perspective it represented. People who felt they were growing in difficult conditions began to see themselves differently. A man with learning disabilities stopped trying to compete in academic environments and found work that used his practical intelligence. A woman with anxiety stopped forcing herself into high-stress social situations and built a life that honored her need for quiet. A family with limited income stopped feeling inadequate for not achieving wealth and found richness in their strong relationships. The shade garden teaching, as people began to call it, spread beyond individuals to organizations. A school started creating shade garden programs for students who couldn't thrive in standard classroom environments. A business developed positions specifically designed for people with limitations that made traditional jobs difficult. A community center created spaces for people who needed accommodations that mainstream spaces didn't provide. Not everyone appreciated this perspective. Some critics said it encouraged people to accept limitations rather than overcoming them. You're telling people to give up, they argued, to accept that they can't thrive in normal conditions rather than working to change their circumstances. Yuki would answer these critics by walking them through her garden. Look at these plants. Should they be working to become sun plants? Should they be trying to overcome their shade-thriving nature? Or should they be celebrated for being excellent at what they actually are? She would point to a struggling plant that needed more light. Sometimes you do need to change conditions. This plant is genuinely in the wrong place. It needs to be moved to a more light-filled place. But most of these plants, they're exactly where they should be, thriving in conditions that sun plants would call impossible. The question isn't whether to overcome all limitations. The question is whether your limitations are like shade for a shade plant, the right conditions for your actual nature, Or like shade for a sun plant, wrong conditions that need to change. A teacher named Nobuo applied this to his classroom. He stopped trying to make all students thrive in the same way. He recognized that some students were sun plants who needed bright, fast-paced, competitive environments. Others were shade plants that needed quiet, slow, supportive conditions. Trying to make shade plant students compete in sun plant ways was as futile as trying to grow ferns in full sun. He created different pathways through his curriculum, different ways to demonstrate learning, and different environments within his classroom. And he found that students he had previously considered struggling were actually thriving. They just needed shade garden conditions to show what they could do. Years later, Yuki's garden became something of a pilgrimage site for people living in difficult circumstances. They would come to see that lushness was possible even in shade, that beauty didn't require ideal conditions, that thriving could look different from what sunny gardens showed. Yuki, now elderly, would sit in her garden talking with visitors. The hardest thing, she would tell them, is stopping comparing yourself to sun gardens. Stop measuring your lushness by their standards. Stop trying to be bright when your beauty is subtle. Once you accept that you're a shade garden, once you stop apologizing for it and start working with it, you discover possibilities you never knew existed. She would touch the ferns and hostas she had planted decades earlier, now mature and magnificent. These plants are barely surviving in bad conditions. They're thriving in ideal conditions for their nature. The shade isn't their obstacle, it's their element. And the same might be true for you. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider the shade you're growing in. The difficult conditions you've been taught to see as obstacles might actually be the right environment for who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who sun gardens demand, but who you actually are. Stop trying to grow sun plants in shade. Stop measuring yourself by standards designed for different conditions. Start asking, what does thriving look like for a shade plant? What can I grow that loves these exact conditions? What beauty can emerge specifically because of these limitations, not despite them? Rest now in your shade garden. Let yourself be a fern, a hosta, a delicate shade flower. Stop burning yourself trying to bloom in full sun. Sink into the cool moisture of your actual conditions and discover what wants to grow there. Shade isn't a deficiency. It's just a different light. And different light creates different beauty. Trust that yours is worth growing. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In a coastal city, there lived a renowned mapmaker named Genji, who had charted more territory than any cartographer of his generation. His maps were detailed, accurate, and highly sought after by merchants, explorers, and military leaders. Every island, every coastline, every mountain range he documented was rendered with precision. But Genji had a practice that other mapmakers mocked. Whenever his knowledge ended, whenever he reached the limits of what had been explored and documented, he would leave the map blank. Large white spaces appeared on his charts, marked only with the words "unknown territory," or sometimes just left empty. Other mapmakers found this approach unprofessional. They would fill in the blank spaces with speculation, with reports from unreliable sources, with educated guesses. A map should be complete, they would argue. Blank spaces make it look unfinished. Blank spaces are honest, Genji would reply. They tell the truth, that we don't know what's there. Filling them with guesses tells a lie, that we do know. But the criticism stung, especially when clients would choose other mapmakers' complete maps over Genji's honest but incomplete ones. People wanted certainty, even false certainty. They wanted maps that told them what lay everywhere, even if those maps were partly fiction. One season, a wealthy merchant named Ichiro commissioned Genji to create a map for a trading expedition to distant islands. When Genji delivered the map, Ichiro was dismayed by the large blank areas. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Ichiro complained. "I need to know what's in these blank spaces. I need to plan my route." "What's in those spaces is unknown," Genji replied. "No reliable expedition has charted them. I can't tell you what I don't know." "But other mapmakers have filled in these areas," Ichiro protested. "They show islands, harbors, channels." "Based on speculation," Genji said. "Based on second-hand rumors and wishful thinking. If you sail using those maps, you'll be navigating by fantasy. My blank spaces at least tell you where certainty ends." Ichiro hired a different map maker who provided a complete map with no blank spaces. The expedition set sail using this fully detailed chart, confident in their route. 3 months later, the expedition returned, having lost 2 ships. They had found islands where the map showed open ocean, encountered reefs where the map showed safe passage, and wasted weeks exploring channels that didn't exist. The complete map had been worse than useless. It had been dangerous. Ichiro returned to Genji, chastened. "Your blank spaces would have saved lives. If I had known we were entering unknown territory, I would have proceeded cautiously. Instead, I trusted a map that pretended to know, and that false certainty led to disaster." "Blank spaces scare people," Genji acknowledged. "They remind us how much we don't know, how limited our understanding is. But pretending we know more than we do is worse than admitting our ignorance. The blank space says, 'Be careful here. Proceed thoughtfully. Don't assume.' The falsely filled space says, 'It's safe to trust this,' which is a dangerous lie." Word spread about Ichiro's disaster and Genji's honest maps. More clients began to value the blank spaces, recognizing them as marks of integrity rather than incompleteness. They learned to read Genji's maps differently. The detailed areas showed where knowledge was reliable. The blank areas showed where caution was needed. A young apprentice named Lin came to study with Genji. She had been trained by other map makers who filled in all spaces, and she struggled with Genji's insistence on leaving blanks. "But we can make educated guesses," Lin argued. "We know the general geography of the region. We can estimate where islands are likely to be." "And we'd be wrong half the time," Genji replied. "An educated guess isn't knowledge. It's speculation with a fancy name. If you mark speculation as if it's fact, you're lying to whoever uses your map." He spread out several maps on his table, his own with its blank spaces, and competitors' maps of the same regions with every space filled. These complete maps look more professional, more finished. But which is more honest? Which better serves someone trusting their life to the information? Lin began to understand, but still she resisted. People don't want to be told we don't know. They want answers, even imperfect ones. Then they want comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths, Genji said. And it's not our job to provide comforting lies. Our job is to chart what's known and clearly mark what's not. The blank space is information. It tells you something important. Here be dragons, or at least here be unknowns. Proceed carefully. Over time, Lin learned to value the blank spaces. She discovered that leaving areas blank required as much skill as filling them in. You had to know exactly where certainty ended, had to resist the temptation to extend your knowledge beyond its actual limits, and had to be comfortable with admitting you didn't have all the answers. One day, an explorer returned from a region Genji had left blank on his maps. The explorer had detailed charts of what was actually there. Your blank space wasn't really blank, the explorer said, showing Genji islands and coastlines that had been unknown before. Now it's not blank, Genji agreed, carefully adding the new information to his map. But it was blank until you explored it. That's how honest maps work. They grow as knowledge grows, but they never pretend to knowledge we don't have. He looked at the transformed map. See how the blank space has been replaced with detail. That's how it should happen. First honest acknowledgement of ignorance, then actual exploration, then knowledge replacing the unknown. But some map makers skip the first step and go straight to filling in spaces with imagination, which prevents anyone from recognizing what actually needs to be explored. Years later, Genji's blank spaces became the very thing that made his maps valuable. Explorers would deliberately seek out the blank spaces on Genji's maps, knowing these marked genuinely unexplored territory rather than cartographic guesswork. Military leaders trusted Genji's maps precisely because they showed where trust should end. A historian interviewing Genji late in his life asked, "Don't the blank spaces bother you? Don't you wish you could fill in all the unknown areas before you die?" "No," Genji replied without hesitation. "The blank spaces are the most honest things on my maps. They say, 'I don't know,' which is often the truest thing a person can say. I could fill them with speculation and fantasy, making maps that look complete. But I'd rather make true maps." He gestured to his life's work, hundreds of maps, all marked with careful detail where knowledge existed and honest blankness where it didn't. These blank spaces are my legacy. They're me admitting the limits of my knowledge, refusing to pretend omniscience, valuing truth over completeness. Every mapmaker who fills in the unknown with guesses is choosing ego over integrity. I choose integrity. The historian looked at a particularly large blank space on one map. Will this ever be filled in? Perhaps, Genji said. Perhaps someone will explore that region and bring back reliable information, or perhaps it will remain blank forever. Either way, my map is honest right now, which is all any map can be. The map maker who fills in that space with speculation is making a map that's dishonest right now, in the hope that by accident he might be correct later. That's not map making. That's gambling. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the blank spaces in your own understanding. Where are you filling in unknowns with speculation, pretending certainty you don't have, telling yourself and others you know things you actually don't? What would it mean to leave those spaces blank, to honestly mark them as unknown? The blank space isn't a failure. It's honesty. It's saying, I don't know, instead of offering false certainty. It's admitting the limits of your understanding rather than pretending those limits don't exist. This feels vulnerable because we're taught that certainty is strength and uncertainty is weakness. But actually, false certainty is weakness disguised as strength, while honest uncertainty is strength willing to show itself. Rest now in your blank spaces. Let yourself not know what you don't know. Let yourself mark large areas of your life, your future, your understanding as unknown territory. This isn't an admission of failure, it's commitment to truth. The mapmaker with blank spaces serves better than the one with false completeness. So do you. Your honest I don't know is more valuable than anyone's false I'm certain. Sleep in the blank spaces tonight where truth lives. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a master calligrapher named Yukiko who had devoted her entire life to the art of beautiful writing. For 60 years, she had practiced daily, creating works that were displayed in temples and palaces throughout the land. Her characters were considered the finest of her generation. But as she grew old, her hands began to shake. The tremor was slight at first, barely noticeable, but gradually it worsened, until she could no longer create the smooth flowing lines that had been her signature. The characters she wrote became jagged, uneven, broken by the involuntary movements of her aging hands. Yukiko was devastated. Calligraphy was not just her work, it was her identity, her life's purpose. She had defined herself through her art for 60 years. Now, unable to produce the quality of work she had maintained for decades, she felt her life was over. If she couldn't create beautiful calligraphy, what was she? She stopped taking commissions. She stopped teaching students. She sat in her studio, staring at blank paper, unable to bring herself to create imperfect work. Each day felt like waiting for death, as if her life had ended, even though her body continued. One day, a young calligrapher named Kenji came to visit her. He had studied her work and wanted to meet her before she died, as he had heard she was no longer creating. "Master Yukiko," he said, bowing deeply, "please, will you show me how you create such beautiful work?" "I can't," Yukiko replied bitterly. "My hands shake. I can no longer do what I once did. My time is over." "Show me anyway," Kenji persisted. "Show me what you do now, even if it's not what you once did." Reluctantly, to satisfy this persistent young man, Yukiko took up her brush. Her hand trembled as she moved it across the paper. The line broke and wavered. The character she was forming looked nothing like the smooth, perfect characters she had created for 60 years. But Kenji was staring at it with wonder. "This is extraordinary." "It's broken," Yukiko said. "It's everything I spent my life learning not to do." "It's alive," Kenji replied. "Your old work was perfect, but this has something your perfect work didn't have. It has a vulnerability. It has humanity. It shows the reality of the hand that made it, the tremor that comes with age, the imperfection that comes with being human. It's no less beautiful. It's beautiful in a different way." He pointed to specific places where the line broke. "See how this break creates a pause, a breath? See how this wobble adds energy, movement. You couldn't create these effects intentionally. They come from not being able to control everything, from allowing the reality of your condition to show. Yukiko looked at her shaky calligraphy with new eyes. She had been seeing only what it wasn't: smooth, controlled, perfect. She hadn't been seeing what it was: authentic, immediate, marked by the truth of her aging body. "You're saying my shaking hands aren't ending my art?" she asked. "They're changing it." "They're revealing a new possibility," Kenji said. "You've mastered perfection. You spent 60 years learning complete control. Now you're learning something else. How to create beauty without control. How to let your limitations become part of your art rather than obstacles to it. This isn't an ending. This is a beginning." Over the following months, Yukiko began to explore what Kenji had called a beginning. She stopped trying to fight against her tremor and started working with it. She let the shakiness show, let the broken lines be part of the aesthetic. Let her aging hands tell their own truth. The work she created was unlike anything she had done before. It had a raw quality, an honesty, a profound beauty that came from acceptance rather than mastery. People who saw it were moved in ways they couldn't quite explain. It touched something in them that perfect calligraphy never had. "Your new work feels more human," one viewer said. "The perfection was impressive, but this is relatable. This shows struggle and acceptance. This shows life as it actually is, not as we wish it to be." Other aging artists heard about Yukiko's transformation and came to see her. They too had been treating their declining abilities as endings, as tragedies that marked the end of their creative lives. Yukiko showed them something different. "What you call an ending is just a transition," she told a painter whose eyesight was failing. "You've lost what you had, yes, but loss creates space for something new. If you spend all your time mourning what's gone, you'll never discover what's trying to arrive." She showed them her shaky calligraphy. "These tremors would have horrified me 5 years ago. I would have hidden this work in shame. But I've learned that every ending contains a beginning. My hands' steady control had to end before I could begin learning to create beauty from their unsteady truth." A sculptor whose arthritis had made detailed work impossible asked, "But how do you accept the loss? How do you stop grieving what you can no longer do?" "I still grieve it sometimes," Yukiko admitted. "I still miss the feeling of complete control, the satisfaction of executing exactly what I envisioned. But I've discovered something. The part of me that created perfect calligraphy was actually quite limited. It could only create what I consciously intended. Now, with my shaking hands, I create things I never could have planned. The imperfection introduces an element beyond my control, and that element often produces more interesting results than my intentions ever did." She held up a piece of her new work. "See this character? I intended it to look one way. My tremor made it look another way. And the way it actually looks is more compelling than what I planned. The beginning I'm in now includes accident, chance, collaboration with my body's wisdom rather than domination of it." Kenji, who continued to visit Yukiko regularly, said, "You've become a better artist by becoming worse at control. Your mastery now includes accepting what you can't master. That's a higher skill than perfect technique ever was. Yukiko nodded. When I had complete control, I could only create versions of what I already knew. Now, with partial control, I'm discovering things I didn't know were possible. The ending of my old art was the beginning of art I couldn't have created any other way. A Zen master who collected calligraphy commissioned a piece from Yukiko. When she delivered it, with all its shaky lines and broken strokes, he hung it in his meditation hall's place of honor. "This shows the essence of Zen," he told his students. "Perfection is static, fixed, dead. This work is dynamic, alive, accepting of change and impermanence." The master's tremor isn't a flaw in the work. It's the work teaching its deepest truth. That beauty includes imperfection. The endings contain beginnings. That loss creates space for discovery. Yukiko lived another 15 years, creating what many considered her finest work during this period. Critics called her late-style revolutionary, noting how it had influenced a generation of younger artists to embrace imperfection and vulnerability in their work. When she finally died at 85, still creating tremor-marked calligraphy to the end, her students gathered to remember her. They spoke of her two periods, the 60 years of perfect control and the 15 years of acknowledged tremor. "Which period was greater?" a young student asked. An older student replied, "She was always great." But she became wise only in her second period, when she learned that endings contain beginnings. When she discovered that what you lose forces you to find what you didn't know was there. When she understood that every door that closes reveals another door you weren't seeing before. Tonight, as you rest, what endings are you mourning? What losses are you treating as pure conclusions with nothing beyond them? What abilities, relationships, or circumstances have ended that you're grieving, as if ending means death rather than transition? Every ending contains a beginning you can't see yet. The closing of one possibility opens others that couldn't have opened if the first possibility had continued. Your losses aren't just subtractions. They're also additions of space, of new potential, of directions you couldn't have gone while the old way remained available. What's ending in you right now isn't your conclusion, it's your transition. Something is completing, so something else can begin. The tremor that seems to be ruining your perfect lines is actually creating new kinds of beauty you couldn't have achieved through control alone. Rest now in acceptance of endings as beginnings in disguise. What's leaving is making room. What's breaking is revealing. What's ending is beginning, just not in ways you can recognize yet. Trust the ending. It knows what it's doing. Every conclusion contains a hidden opening, and you're moving toward it even as you mourn what's closing behind you. Sleep now in the space between ending and beginning, knowing that this space itself is fertile ground where something unexpected and beautiful is already starting to grow. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly. Whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes." "The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence." Another guest agreed. "I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection." Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. I thought mastery meant perfect execution, Soho told his students later. I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans. He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence. One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence." He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. "See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, You might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough. You've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.